chapter 30, Society in Flux. So we're really focusing on this word here, flux. This chapter emphasizes how geographically mobile Americans became, starting when Henry Ford put out the Model T, but into the 50s, 60s, and 70s as the interstate highway system was being built. Americans became extremely mobile. If you think about what our day is like even now, traveling from place to place to place, we spend a lot of time in the car, and as a result, motor vehicle accidents are the leading cause of death for young people. So we're looking at how Americans became more mobile, but also the advent of television, the growth of the middle class, how religion changed in the 60s and 70s, and we'll continue talking about student radicalism as well. Society on the move. So after World War I, there was rapid and profound change. The depression that had racked the country and the world, really, in the 1930s gave way to prosperity. There were still some issues for minorities and females, as they were still excluded from equal access to jobs and education. But technology advanced with breathtaking speed and continues to do so, and technological change contributed to social change. Not to mention the fact that Americans were now geographically mobile. The automobile obviously was the contributing factor to that mobility and had a tremendous impact on American life. Travel by car led to the development of a new business, motels, which is actually a combination of the words motor and hotel. The construction of the interstate highway system. This also contributed to the mobility of Americans. Of course, it did come with some ecological costs, as you had to cut through lots of land in order to create roads, and high monetary costs as well. Not to mention the jet aircraft, which spurred the growth of commercial air travel. Another thing that changed rapidly and changed society rapidly was the advent of the television. This industry grew dramatically during the 1950s, and by 1961, there were about 55 million television sets in operation around the country. It did become an indispensable means of political communication. TV covered both the news and, again, provided a vehicle for political advertising. And in doing so, it changed American politics because for the first time, rather than just hearing a presidential candidate on the radio giving speeches or giving his opinion on things, they could actually be seen as well. And so as early as 1952, Republicans made use of these spots, as they were called. And there were 20-second tapes of presidential candidates responding to questions about their political opinions of major issues. And this was rapid. Rather than having to print this in a newspaper or wait a week or two for it to come out through some other means, it was instant, and it was instant communication with much of America. This was later used to attack opponents as well, not just to give out information. There were some good quality dramas and documentaries and children's programs. The general level of programming was poor, but children and their parents still found this new medium very fascinating. Children sat transfixed in front of the screen, and their elders, of course, yelled at them, saying they should be outdoors or they should be reading a book, things like that. Sports events were televised for the first time as well, and extremely popular. In the 1980s, the growth of cable television diminished the importance of the networks, and it also increased the variety of programming available to viewers. Another thing that came out during this time was the videotape recorder, and this changed the viewing habits of Americans as well. People began to capture birthday parties and weddings and all sorts of events on camera. So at home and at work. So the wartime trend toward earlier marriages and large families accelerated even more as the war ended. There were government policies in place, such as income tax deductions for dependents, that further encouraged people to have children. Basically, they get a tax break the more children they have. So household management and child rearing really became the career of choice for millions of American women, including college graduates. Women who had attended college for all 4 years, got a degree, and then they got married and decided that they would rather stay home with their children. Scholars even supported the notion that women belonged in the home, that it was the best place for her, and that she could most effectively rear her children if she were there at home with them. Although men did assume the prominent role in some domestic or at-home rituals, they were expected to cede the management of the domestic sphere to the women, to entrust that the woman would take care of the issues at home. And the man's primary contribution to his family was to earn enough to sustain it. Unemployment remained low during this time, but the character of work changed in some unsettling ways. Mainly, that World War II accelerated the growth of large corporations. And in order to run a large corporation, they had to hire more managers and more assistants and clerical workers who had to complete mountains of paperwork for the corporation, which in essence made the company less productive. The door-to-door salesman was replaced by advertising companies and the organization man. The organization man, this was a term first used by sociologist William White, and he said that these men went to college, they got a B average, they joined sports teams and clubs, they got married, and then they went to work for a large corporation, and he had to give up his own interests, including his tastes in clothing and housing and cars, to the requirements of his company. To successfully meet the requirements of his company. His wife had to be beautiful and attractive, and she couldn't drink too much at the company Christmas party or do anything crazy because it might make her husband look bad. There was a dramatic increase in suburbs during this time, and it gave a physical dimension to the emerging ideas of family life. And it reinforced the desire to have larger families, and government policies actually encouraged the growth of suburbs, usually through tax breaks. Not all women who lived in the suburbs, though, portrayed the life that was shown in television situation comedies. Substantial numbers of women still worked outside of the home, particularly in the clerical and service sectors of the economy. In the years after World War II, there was a marked growth of the middle class. The middle class expanded rapidly, and not only did it expand, it actually became more culturally homogenous, meaning there were less immigrants. It was more culturally uniform. In 1947, there were about 5 million middle class families, and by the early 60s, there were about 12 million families that were considered middle class. So this number more than doubled. And the label middle class just meant that they could afford to pay all of their bills and then spend money on vacations and leisure activities and things like that. There were tens of thousands of blue-collar workers. These are people who work with their hands who entered the middle class status. With that, they also entered the suburbs. And the suburbs had previously been reserved for like junior executives. But the middle class, they moved into the suburbs, they shed their work clothes for business suits, they took up golf and the values of the middle class. Like I said, the percentage of immigrants also declined during this time in the population. By 1965, 95% of Americans were native born. So religion during this time. After World War II, church attendance and synagogue attendance actually rose. And in 1954, of course, Congress put "Under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance and "In God We Trust" on the nation's currency. And it's important to remember that organized religion in general deals with eternal values, but it's almost always also affected by the social, cultural, and political values of the times. And this was certainly true in the post-war era. Religious toleration did become much more the norm after World War II. Churches became more secular in orientation, and there was a growing trend toward conformity of the church to culture. The civil rights movement, for one, involved many mainstream clergymen and religions in political activism. There were lots of critics of religion. Many of them were feminist critics who challenged religious assumptions. Science and technology also served as a critic and an influencer of religion. Some people had never really made peace with Darwin's theories of evolution and still wanted creationist theories taught in school. Medical science created all kinds of new ethical problems. For instance, should we take every measure to prolong life, even if the quality of life is not good? Or can we or should we encode genes to generate the type of offspring that we want? What are the rights and the responsibilities of pregnant women? So this became a major issue. Also, television and the church. So television provided a pulpit from which religious leaders could reach more and more people. Evangelical preachers proved to be the most adept, actually, at using the electronic media. And by the 1970s, a militant fundamentalist brand of preachers pretty much dominated the airways. They preached not only conservative religious values, but also conservative political and social views as well. And of course, in the 80s, there were a series of scandals involving many of these preachers that did diminish the influence of televangelists. Literature and art. So after World War I, there was an outpouring of new literary works. This wasn't so much true after World War II. There were some fine writers, lots of novelists such as Norman Mailer, J.D. Salinger, Saul Bellow, Joseph Heller, and John Updike. And with that, the sale of paperbacks grew enormously. The expansion of the book market did have some drawbacks as well as benefits. The benefits, there were enormous profits to be made. A lot of times, though, the downside was that publishers favored established authors. So if you were an unknown writer or an aspiring author or something like that, it was really difficult for you to earn a living. During this time, there was also a genuinely American expression of art that emerged with the New York school. There were some abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock who approached art subjectively. There were some other experiments as well. For one, op art. This is the use of pure complementary colors to produce dynamic optical effects. And then pop art, which was almost always used as like a satirical aspect of American culture. Pop art came back with the election of President Obama. He was, I guess, pop arted. I'm not sure how to put that, but there was a lot of pop art of President Obama, and that's really seemed to make a comeback recently. Okay, so we will go ahead and bring this to a close, and we'll pick up in the next video with the costs of this post-war prosperity.